Okay, so we were just about to figure out, why would the Greeks have a myth where Kronos castrates his father Uranos? And I think there are a couple of different reasons for this. One of them is that there seems to be a real generational rivalry or tension between fathers and sons, especially in this story. And we're going to see more examples of that. But it seems like the father is the king of the universe, and then the son comes along, and suddenly there's a challenger for king of the universe. So over the course of these generations, the Greeks imagined different challengers coming along and confronting each other. And this may reflect a real tension between ancient Greek men, that the fathers had this sort of rivalry with their sons in some way. And we'll say more about that in just a second. But the other thing I really want to talk about is fertility. So fertility seems to be at the core of all this weirdness to do with chopping people's body parts off. I would basically define fertility as a kind of magic power almost, that has to do with the power to create life. So in this story, we start off with the void, and the question is, who's going to create the next generations of gods? Who's going to have the power over life? At the very beginning, we just have this asexual reproduction, but then we quickly move into this sexual reproduction where there's partners, and it seems like the power to create life lies with Earth originally, and then to some extent gets passed on to Sky. And so, people didn't know necessarily why are babies born. They have a sense of the reproductive process, but not the details of it. So the mythology kind of tends to reflect that. And there's also a sense that this power over life is the power of the gods to make things happen in the world, this almost like sacred or holy power. And it's also the power to make the crops grow, which is very important, as we saw with Demeter. And so there's a real question of how do gods have this fertility? How does anyone have this kind of fertility? And if you're looking for the source of the fertility, you might think it's a magic power that rests in a certain kind of the body. For the goddesses, it's the womb. For the gods, it's the groin region, shall we say. And so if Kronos is confronting his father and taking away his genitals, that is, that is a power move, as it would be today. And it takes away this power to create life. It takes it from Sky and moves it to Kronos. And then on top of that, it's also this collusion between the mother and the son. And this might reflect ancient Greek gender norms too. Remember what I said about the women in Greek marriages being relatively young, so that they were a lot closer to their children emotionally than these distant fathers who were always going off to war and doing things like that. So there might be indeed a sort of war of the mother and the child against the father. Okay. But it doesn't end there. All sorts of interesting stuff happens there. We should mention that the castration leads to a goddess called Aphrodite. In fact, when Uranos's genitals are chopped off, they land in the ocean, and from, quote, the foam comes Aphrodite. And maybe we want to interpret foam in a variety of different ways, but that's very interesting, because what is Aphrodite the goddess of? She's the goddess of love, or to put it another way, sexuality. She's basically the goddess of fertility in the very specifically sexuality sense, whereas Demeter is more like fertility in the growing the grain sense. But Aphrodite is all about that sexuality. So it's very interesting that she comes from, the groin region. And from drops of blood, you get things like Cyclopes, Furies, the 100-hand people, also known as the Hecatoncheires, which is just Greek for 100-hand people. And so you have all these interesting weird monsters and creatures. But then we move into the next generation, and Rhea and Kronos have a bunch of children. And now we're getting into the generation of gods that are most familiar, because these gods are going to stick around. Uranos is gone. He just fled away somewhere. And I guess I should say, in terms of talking about all this fertility, that the theogony means the births of the gods. So theogonos, gonos like gonads. Um, so it's all about this sort of process of birth and fertility when you get right down to it. So the next generation of gods includes Zeus and Hera. We've also got Demeter, Poseidon, Hades. I believe Hestia is another one of them. She's not involved in a whole lot of myths, but she is the goddess of the home, and so she doesn't get out much necessarily. But she has an important ritualistic role. So now we have another couple, Zeus and Hera, but we're not quite there yet because Kronos is going to try and destroy his own children. And how does he do this? He eats his children. He swallows them alive. And understandably, Rhea is kind of upset about this. So she realizes that pretty soon he's going to eat them all and there's not going to be any of them left. So she teams up with Earth, or Gaia, to trick Kronos. So they trick him into eating a stone. She wraps it up in, swaddling clothes, baby clothes, and so he thinks that he's eating baby Zeus, and in fact he's eating a stone instead. So Zeus is saved, and Rhea sends him off somewhere to be raised by nymphs and fauns on a special island of Crete in a special cave. And there's all sorts of weird, obscure stories about Zeus being raised and the young Zeus. But we know Zeus mostly when he's grown up. So when he grows up, he comes back and he defeats Kronos in combat, and he forces him to vomit up all the other siblings. So it's very, Little Red Riding Hood. They're just in there. They're still alive. So he just throws them back up, and then Kronos is defeated. And now Zeus is king of the universe. Almost. Because he's got another problem now. And this is where it gets interesting from a gender norms perspective. Previously, we had the men against the men. Now we have the men against the women, the gods versus the goddesses. Because for obscure reasons, even though they were allies before, Gaia and Zeus come into conflict. She begins to give birth to monsters. And basically gathers all these sort of monsters across Greek mythology. And there's other figures, too, that give birth to monsters, like Echidna. But there's a lot of sort of monstrous mothers in Greek mythology. So Zeus now has to fight Gaia and all her monsters and defeat them in order to finally become king of the universe. And this suggests almost like there's some sort of fear of the women, fear of the goddesses going on here as well. And that the goddesses, they give birth, but they shouldn't be too powerful. They're too dangerous to Zeus, and they kind of threaten his control over things. Because remember, what did Gaia do to Uranos? Well, she found a way to have him castrated, and Rhea was able to trick Kronos. So there's a sense in which the male gods can't trust the goddesses, so they've got to do something about that, and they can't trust their own children. So Zeus is running into a problem now, which is, isn't this cycle just going to continue indefinitely? Isn't there going to be a danger to Zeus that another son might overthrow him? And in fact, there are prophecies that very thing is going to happen. One of them says if Zeus marries or even just sleeps with a particular goddess who is called Metis, then that son will be greater than his father. And of course, Zeus doesn't want that to happen. So here's what he does about Metis, because Zeus is Zeus. Zeus's whole thing in Greek mythology is he sleeps around with whoever he wants, and he has a lot of children, and that's just kind of an amusing character trait of his, that he is, he is the playboy. But he wants to get what he wants out of this interaction with Metis. And Metis' name means cleverness. Or trickery in a certain sense, trickiness, cleverness, stuff like that. So we've got the goddess who is literally the embodiment of trickiness. And what have these goddesses been up to? They're tricky. The men, they have force, which is called bias in Greek. This force, men have won all their confrontations here by brute strength. But the women are being tricky and clever because they have to be, they don't have a whole lot of other options here. But this kind of becomes the stereotype that women are devious in Greek mythology. And you can see this saying some things about this, the culture and some antagonistic relationships between men and women here. But Zeus is going to have to find a way to deal with this sort of trickiness that women have. And he also wants to control the fertility. Because women, the goddesses, they've been mother goddesses, They have all this potential for fertility. They seem to have more fertility than the men even. They are the ones who can give birth, whereas the men are not. Zeus is going to have to find a way to seize control. He's defeated this one woman. Now he has to sort of secure his rule. So what does he do? Well, with Metis in particular, he does something very clever. We're back to eating people again. He turns Metis into a fly, and then he swallows her. He eats her. And then 9 months later, Zeus has this splitting headache, and then he gets one of the gods, Hephaestus, to crack his skull open. And then out of his skull is born Athena, fully clothed in battle armor, who is, of course, the goddess of wisdom. So you've got cleverness turning into wisdom, and that's not all. You've got this threat turning into something that is very positive for Zeus, because Athena is the most loyal goddess to Zeus. She is his right-hand woman, and she also never grows up and gets married, so she's not threatening in that way. She stays with Zeus, and the prophecy of Metis has been defeated because he's had a daughter instead of a son. So there's a lot of stuff like going on like that. And there's another prophecy about the mother of Achilles that's pretty similar. For that one, Zeus just has Thetis, the mother of Achilles, just married off to a mortal. So then Achilles can be greater than that mortal. But you see how Zeus has taken this for himself. And here's the other interesting thing. He has taken the fertility away from the goddesses. He is from the women in this story. Because what did he do? He gave birth effectively through his head. He took Metis's power to give birth, and he kind of absorbed her into him. And isn't that a very clever move? So he's taken the cleverness as well. He's taken literally Metis. So he's accomplished quite a lot. And when we look at some other versions of this story, we start to see that this is really about these themes of fertility on this fundamental level. Looking at other cultures that were sort of connected to the Greeks, one of the interesting ones is the Hurrians, who live in this part of the world over here. And they tell a story that's very similar about their gods. Only in this case, you have the eating and the castration going on at the same time. One of their gods bites off his father's genitals, and then he becomes pregnant, and he gives birth to a storm god, who is pretty similar to Zeus. And there's another Greek version where Zeus also eats his own father's genitals. So it's all about this fertility. Like, how are you going to have this magic power? How are you going to take it into you? And this is how you do it. By eating it, by basically having a male womb, using the belly as a way of getting pregnant, things like that. It's all about this idea of fertility, and fertility is power, and now the men have the power in the story and not the women. So that's pretty interesting. And let's look a little bit more at the implications of that in the next video.